Hey everyone. A while back, I did this talk at CackalackyCon, and it was very popular with many of you and with everyone there. It's all about fire suppression systems and building codes and life safety. It's all of the trappings of being a physical security professional. It's not all, Donnie Doorbuster bullshit. I'm very happy with all the ways that that's gotten a reaction and like feedback, much like with Howard and I and elevators. People still to this day like send me elevator stuff. And just the other day, someone, I think it was probably a new Schindler system. It didn't quite look like their destination dispatch. I was scratching my head at it, but like I love that kind of interaction online. And likewise, now like fire suppression stuff. People send me pictures of fire alarms and fire suppression systems and sprinklers, and I share ones as well, right? So I was on the way to tour camp. I was on the vessel, the ferry, I guess it was the vessel Yakima, one of the ferries that was getting us out to the islands. And we're on the parking deck right above the truck. I looked up and there was a pendant style discharge head. And I was like, oh, interesting. It's clearly a deluge system. There's no membrane, there's no fusible link, there's no glass bulb. And I throw pictures of that on Instagram. By the way, there was not a misspelling in my slide. Somebody once reached out to me like, hey, you spelled pendant wrong. Yes and no, like pendant as in like with an A is a necklace, like a pendant. It comes from the same Latin, but pendant to hang down. Yes, this is a pendant style Grinnell head seen here as well. And it's a totally open pipe, right? But it was neat. In fact, some of the comments, even you could see people saying, wow, some of the people responding to this didn't see your talk because some people, that I was expressing a problem or concern. Like, hey, this sprinkler head's missing pieces. No, not at all. This is perfectly normal. In fact, this is an example, as I said later on in follow-up, of what's known as a deluge system. With water-based fire suppression systems coming out of, standard sprinkler heads that you've seen, there are roughly 4 categories of those types of systems. We talked about this in the CackalackyCon talk as well. But for those who didn't want to spend 2 hours watching that, if you're curious, there's wet pipe, dry pipe, pre-action, and deluge. And roughly speaking, the way I like to remember it, and I tell others, wet pipe you put in when you care about cost, because it's literally the most common system that exists. You have a standpipe full of water, pressurized water comes out of the pipes. It's easy. Very little can go wrong with it. Dry pipe is what you put in when you care about freezing. So if you have an area that is susceptible to freezing temperatures, parking garages, outdoors, very common to see this. Instead of putting water in the pipes all the way up to the sprinkler heads, they're full of pressurized air. And if the glass bulb or fusible link blows, the air will escape. And when the pressurized air drops, that allows a valve elsewhere in the system. It's a neat system where low pressure air can hold back high pressure water. And that's to do with the shape of the valve. But essentially, that valve will pop open, water floods the pipe, and within 60 seconds or so is the permissible maxima. You get water dumping right where that sprinkler head blew. Pre-action is very similar. It's a little more complicated, but pre-action is a dry pipe system where you have pressurized air, but the pipe doesn't flood based on that pressure differential valve pop. In order to get the pipe to flood, other sensors, pre-action sensors, have to go off, heat, smoke, etc. They're almost always heat-based, the ones I've seen. They're calibrated for something like 10 degrees Celsius less than the actual bulb temperature is blowing. That's what, like 15, 20 degrees less Fahrenheit. So let's say you've got 135 Fahrenheit, it's going to blow the bulb. The pre-action sensor, the heat sensor, would have gone off at like 115, 120 degrees. So the system is like geared up and it's like, all right, we got a fire. If those bulbs blow, we got to start moving water. But you put those in when you care about damage. You care about devastating data loss of like a data center. You used to see them in data centers. Nowadays, clean agent, much more common in data centers. But in some machine rooms and sensitive equipment areas, you don't want an accidental damage to the pipes or to a sprinkler head to cause a water discharge. Pre-action will help mitigate that risk. The 4th category, though, is deluge. Deluge is what you put in when your main concern is disaster. And you'll see these in high hazard environments, factories working with a lot of flammables. But where we see them here, I mean, the vehicle deck of a maritime vessel, that's a prime candidate for a deluge system, right? Because disaster, like fire on a ship, is a real freaking problem. A vessel that's out at sea, if there's a bad enough fire, like getting people off the ship, it's kind of ironic, right? Like seafaring vessels are surrounded by water, so the fire's not going to spread, but the fire where it is going to be a goddamn problem. Getting people off the vessel it's a huge pain in the dick, and there's great susceptibility to injury and drowning and other things when you try to do that. And if the fire gets really bad and you like lose motive power, then you're stuck. Like you can't get into a port where there's greater rescue and firefighting. Maybe you're like drifting and moving and like then you can't keep the ship on station and it's going to crash into something or run aground. So yeah, getting a fire contained rapidly, regardless of like water damage. So it's a ship. There's always water around the ship. That's what you want. So that absolutely made sense because obviously you're not seeing a glass bulb break. There's no glass bulbs in these sprinkler heads. How do they work? Well, there's zones. They're sectioned off into different zones. And if there is a fire detected, you can manually trigger or sensors can automatically trigger water to flood these pipes. And then all the pipes in that zone, they all have these open heads on the sprinkler system. All of those Grinnell heads are just going to start dumping water. So that's what you would see in this environment. And unless you work in a particularly high hazard area or something like that, being out on the ferries or being sometimes in other transit, I've seen deluge systems around transit tracks, train tracks, especially for metro and subways. But that's one of the few places you as a regular civilian might encounter a deluge type fire suppression system. So yes, vehicles on the parking deck of a ferry, I mean, they're already exposed to ocean spray and stuff. These are open decks. And cars, like cars are already kind of used to being outside. So getting hit with water, not the worst thing. And when you compare that to the very tight, constrained circumstances, they're really packed in. Cars have a lot of flammable material. They carry a lot of fuel most of the time, or a battery fire would be bad. They're prime candidates for something like that suppression that you see there. However, I loved the fact that, again, I was sharing that online. Somebody shot a message to me. I was actually at camp. I was at tour camp, and someone said, hey, we came up here. We were on a different vessel. And look at these things. Look at these weird overhead. What do we got going on with, what is this? Is this fire suppression? And I was like, I bet you got yourself a water misting system there. So yes, indeed. What is this? On the way home from tour camp, we were on a different vessel, right? On Sunday afternoon, we were on the Chelan, which is another one of the vessels in the Washington State ferry system. It is, I wouldn't say a newer vessel. They're all roughly the same age, but the Chelan is one that's been modernized. I learned the actual reason for the program. It has to do with SOLAS, or safety of life at sea. It's a standard for maritime vessels and international transit. The vessels of the ferry system that can go to Canada, they all have to be SOLAS compliant. So yes, some Washington State ferries now are using high fog, or it's a high pressure water misting system. What is high fog? It's really freaking cool. So when we were on the vessel coming home back to Anacortes, I always speak to the ferry staff. They're really cool. Most of the ferry employees are all really big ferry fans, and I'm a big transit head, so like I just love bullshitting with them. They're really, and by the way, like if you like public transit and if you want a really rockin' job, if you live in the Pacific Northwest especially, consider the ferry system. They're always hiring. The ferry right now needs to expand. There's been a whole new measure. We're not going to get into local politics, but like getting more boats in the service, in the fleet. There used to be a law that required them to be built in Washington, and there's only so many companies that build ferry craft. So that law is repealed. There's bids coming in from all around the country now. We're hopefully going to see more vessels and maybe more staff. So if that could be you, apply. If I can find their jobs page, I'm going to link it down below. It's a wonderful network. It supports so many people for pleasure and also just for day-to-day, living on all the islands up here. I spoke to Evan, one of the ferry workers, really cool cat. And I was like, hey, talk to me about what's going on here. Is this a misting system? He's like, oh yeah, we call it high fog. And I was like, yep, I know high fog very well. I said, I have a few questions though, because you've undergone training. I've only read about this stuff. I was like, why, like, do you pull water from the outside, like through the firefighting pumps, because you're surrounded by water? How does this work? He's like, no, well, that's actually one of the benefits. And for those who don't know, high fog, and I'll throw videos in if I can find them. It is a water-based fire suppression system. It uses very high pressure mist. It will contain fire. It'll put out fire. It'll cool the fire. It'll saturate and push oxygen out of displace the oxygen in the room. But it uses like less than a tenth of the water of conventional fire suppression. So for cleanup, that's really, really good. Cleanup after a fire deployment of, water system is usually a mess. So that's one great thing about it. But also, as Evan was telling me, he's like, no, we actually have water reservoirs on the vessel. That's what we deploy. And you're toting around, like, water is not small and it's not light. So using less of it is a really good thing. Now, I didn't get into this with him. I assume there must be a way for auxiliary firefighting equipment to use the water from around the ferry if they had to. But I just assumed like, oh, they must pump from the outside. And he's like, no. And that actually makes sense when you think about it. First of all, you don't want salt water spraying all over everything, especially indoors in the passenger compartments. Like, again, that's just more corrosive and a mess to clean up. But also, like, if you're pumping in water, you could be pumping in fouling and crap from the sound. You could pumping in marine life, like throwing seaweed through the firefighting system. Like, no one wants that. So I understand why they use onboard water stores. I know for a fact that other much larger vessels, ocean liners, cruise ships, they absolutely do pull water in from the surrounding ocean because, again, fighting a fire in a vessel that huge, you have all different fire suppression pumps that are manually activated and they're spraying hoses on the flames. Fortunately, we've gotten a lot better at fighting fire at sea because, again, if you're way out in the ocean, containing the fire is such a huge priority. Because, again, like a fire way out at sea is a huge disaster. You need to be like, you need to get that contained right away. And speaking of cruise ships, I am not a cruise ship person at all. If you're on a cruise ship, good luck to you. It's not my thing. There was a wonderful, completely irrelevant to this, but there was a wonderful anecdote sort of comment that I love this. It was on Bluesky or Instagram. A woman was talking about, she's like, I'm not a cruise ship person. Some people are, but let's not generalize, but think of your suburbanite, middle America type people, the people you might know who go on cruises or really into cruises. She was like, are these people just that hurting for walkable cities? Like they just are enamored with the idea of like getting up from the place you're sleeping, stepping out a door and walking right to where you can eat. And then walking right to where you can have a drink and socialize. And then like walking right to a place you could play sports. And then walking to a nightclub and then like walking back to your sleep. That's what we have in the city. Maybe that's why I don't know anyone in big cities who goes on cruises, but more power to you. If you go on a cruise, look at the ceiling of your passenger compartment. You might see a high fog head. They are out there. I've never seen them in like regular general purpose structures these days. I think they're more expensive. They're newer, obviously. But yeah, if you're on the Chelan or on other vessels in the ferry fleet, check them out. High fog is really cool. And even though it's much less water, it does a great job. There was even a story, this is back in 2006. What the hell was it? The Star Princess was the cruise ship that had a fire. And it took a while to fight. It's an interesting story. I had to do, the fire was outside on a balcony, which are considered open deck, and the fire regulations were different for what suppression they needed. But high fog kept all the interior compartments safe. And there's even stories of passengers when they were let back into their rooms eventually, and some of the rooms are kind of damp, they were finding like chocolate bars and other amenities that hadn't even melted. Because again, the high fog just takes the heat and flame right out of the area quickly. And now I believe they also are required even on those balcony spaces too, where somebody's cigarette caught something on fire. But there you go. If you're on the ferries, look up above you. Maybe you'll see an open pipe deluge system, or maybe you'll see a high fog head, or maybe you see something even different, something newer than that. Let me know if you see something like that. And again, if I'm wrong about pulling in water from the outside on the state ferries, if you work for the ferries, first of all, good job. Thanks for taking us places on the islands. But let me know down in the comments if I'm right or wrong about any of this. I'll see you online with more talk of firefighting or elevators or whiskey or who knows what. I'll see you at StateCon, at some of you in DEF CON. I'm about to sign up for that right now. DEF CON is coming around the corner. Datagram's going to get that announcement out. I'll see some of you in Vegas. I'll see some of you elsewhere, but wherever you are, hopefully you don't burn in any fires. The fire suppression works above your heads, and each one of you can stay safe out there.